The guidance counselor called me during fourth period on a Tuesday in April. She said I needed to come to her office right away, and I thought I was in trouble for something. When I got there, she was smiling, and she had an envelope on her desk with the State University logo in the corner. She said congratulations before I even sat down. Full ride scholarship. Academic and need-based combined. Everything covered, including room and board for 4 years. I just had to maintain a 3.0 GPA, and I'd be the first person in my family to go to college without loans. I called my mom from the counselor's office because I couldn't wait until I got home. She answered on the third ring, and I told her I got the scholarship, and there was this long pause where I thought maybe the call dropped. Then she said, "That's nice, honey," and she had to go because she was at the grocery store. That's nice, honey. Not, "Oh my God," or "I'm so proud of you," or "Let me call your father." Just "That's nice, honey," like I told her I made honor roll again or cleaned my room without being asked. I thought maybe she didn't understand what it meant, so I said, "It's a full ride, Mom, and everything is paid for, and I don't have to take out loans." She said, "We'll talk about it when you get home," and then she hung up. The counselor was still smiling at me, and she said, "My parents must be so excited." I said, "Yeah, they are," because I didn't know what else to say. When I got home that afternoon, my mom was in the kitchen putting groceries away, and I showed her the acceptance letter. She looked at it for maybe 5 seconds, and then she handed it back and said, "We need to talk about this as a family." My dad got home an hour later, and I showed him the letter, and he read it standing in the doorway still wearing his work boots. He said, "This is a big decision, and we shouldn't rush into anything." I said, "What decision? And there's nothing to decide because it's a full ride, and I already got in." He said there's always a decision, and he needed time to think about it. That's when I started feeling sick in my stomach. We sat down for dinner, and nobody said anything about the scholarship. My mom asked my dad how work was, and he said fine, and then we just ate in silence. I kept waiting for one of them to bring it up or ask me questions about the campus or the program, but they just ate. After dinner, I went to my room, and I heard them talking in low voices in the kitchen, but I couldn't make out the words. The next day, my mom didn't ask me about school when I got home. She was folding laundry in the living room, and when I walked in, she looked at me and then looked away and kept folding. I asked her if she was okay, and she said she was fine. My dad came home late that night and went straight to the garage. On Thursday morning, there were boxes in the hallway. Not moving boxes, but the kind you get from the liquor store with the dividers still in them. I asked my mom what they were for, and she said just some reorganizing. I had to take the scholarship paperwork to the counselor by Friday morning. There was a parental signature line at the bottom because I was still 17 and wouldn't turn 18 until June. The counselor said it was just a formality, but it had to be signed or the university couldn't process the acceptance. I brought the paperwork to my dad Thursday night. He was in the living room watching TV, and I put the papers on the coffee table in front of him, and I said, "I need you to sign this by tomorrow morning." He looked at the papers, and then he looked at me, and he said, "I don't think you're ready for this." I said, "Ready for what?" And he said, "College and living on your own and making these kinds of decisions." I said, "I'm going to be 18 in 2 months, and this is a full-ride scholarship, and I've been planning for college since freshman year." He said, "Plans change, and sometimes what we think we want isn't what's best for us." My mom was standing in the doorway, and I looked at her and I said, "Mom, please." She didn't say anything. She just looked at my dad, and then she turned around and walked away. I couldn't sleep that night because I kept thinking about what to do if he didn't sign. The counselor said I could petition for emancipation or wait until I turned 18, but by then the deadline would have passed and the scholarship would go to someone else. I got up at 6 in the morning on Friday, and I went downstairs to find my parents, and the house was different. The living room furniture was in different places. The pictures on the walls were gone. The kitchen table still had my scholarship paperwork sitting on it right where I'd left it the night before, but the chairs were pulled out at strange angles like someone left in a hurry. I called for my mom and nobody answered. I went upstairs, and their bedroom door was open and the bed was made, but their closet was half empty. My dad's work boots were gone from the hallway. My mom's purse wasn't on the hook by the door. There was a note on the kitchen counter next to the scholarship papers. It was in my mom's handwriting on the back of an electric bill envelope. It said, "You're an adult now, and you don't need us anymore, and you'll figure it out like everyone else does." That was it. No explanation, no phone number, no forwarding address, just "You're an adult now." I stood in the kitchen holding that note, and I looked at the scholarship paperwork with the blank signature line, and the deadline was in 3 hours, and I didn't know what to do. I called my best friend Sarah at 6:30 in the morning, and I was crying so hard I couldn't get the words out at first. She lived 2 streets over, and she was at my house in 10 minutes. Her mom came with her, and when they walked in and saw the note and the empty closets, her mom just said, "Oh, honey," and pulled me into a hug. Sarah's mom called the school and talked to the guidance counselor and explained what happened. The counselor said she'd come in early and we could figure something out. We got to the school at 7:15 and the counselor looked at the note and she looked at me and she said, "I'm so sorry." She made some calls and then she said the university would accept a signature from a legal guardian or a court-appointed advocate, but that would take weeks, and the deadline was today. Then she said, "Unless you're emancipated or 18, we can't process this without a parent." Sarah's mom asked what happens if she just doesn't go home. The counselor said, "That's a conversation for social services and the police, and it would take time we didn't have." I sat there watching the clock on the wall and thinking about how my parents planned this. They waited until the last possible day to leave, so I couldn't do anything about it. They made sure I'd missed the deadline. Sarah's mom said she was taking me home with her, and we'd figure out the rest later. The scholarship was gone by noon. The counselor called and said the alternate candidate had accepted, and there was nothing else she could do. She said I could reapply next year, but there was no guarantee of funding. I kept thinking they'd call. That first week at Sarah's house, I checked my phone every hour. I thought maybe this was some kind of test, or they were trying to scare me, or they'd realized they made a mistake and come back. Sarah's parents didn't ask me questions. I couldn't answer. Her mom just helped me apply for emergency financial aid, and her dad drove me to the university to talk to the admissions office about work study. I turned 18 on June 7th. Sarah's family made me a cake and sang happy birthday, and her little brother gave me a card he'd made with markers. I cried in the bathroom after because my parents didn't call, and I realized they really weren't coming back. I got into the same university on academic merit, but I had to take out loans for everything. The work study didn't cover. $17,000 for the first year. Sarah's parents co-signed because I didn't have credit history, and I promised them I'd pay it back. I moved into the dorms in August with one suitcase and the backpack I'd been carrying the day my parents left. My roommate had 3 parents with her and a minivan full of stuff, and I unpacked my things in 10 minutes, and then I went to the library and cried. I worked 25 hours a week shelving books and scanning IDs at the front desk. I sent money to Sarah's parents every month, even though they told me not to worry about it. I couldn't take anything else from them without paying it back. That first semester, I'd see other students on the phone with their parents, and I'd have to leave the room. I saw a girl crying outside the dining hall once because her mom forgot to send her care package on time, and I wanted to shake her. I thought about my parents constantly. I replayed the last 2 weeks over and over, trying to find the moment I should have known, the coldness after the counselor's call, the boxes in the hallway, my dad saying plans change. I kept thinking if I'd just paid more attention or asked different questions, I could have stopped them from leaving. Sarah came to visit me twice that first semester, and both times she found me in my dorm room not doing anything, just sitting there. She'd make me go get food or go to a movie or something, and I'd feel okay for a few hours, and then it would come back. I failed a midterm in October because I couldn't concentrate. The professor called me into her office and asked if everything was okay at home, and I said yes automatically because I didn't know how to explain that I didn't have a home. But I got through it. I retook the midterm, and I passed the class, and I kept working, and I kept showing up, and by the end of freshman year, I had a 3.4 GPA. Sophomore year was easier. I thought about my parents less. I made friends who didn't know about the scholarship or the abandonment, and I could pretend I was just a normal college student with loans like everyone else. I graduated with a 3.8 GPA in May when I was 22. Sarah's parents came to the ceremony, and they screamed when they called my name, and her dad took about 100 pictures. They took me to dinner after, and Sarah's mom gave me a card with $500 in it and a note that said, "We're so proud of you." I cried reading it because it was the first time anyone had said that to me in 4 years. I got a job in marketing 40 minutes from campus, and I moved into a tiny apartment with 2 roommates. I started paying down my student loans, $200 a month, which barely touched the interest, but it was what I could afford. I met Tom at work when I was 24. He was in IT, and he fixed my computer when it crashed, and we started talking, and 3 months later we were dating. He asked about my family on our second date, and I told him we weren't in touch, and he didn't push. We got married when I was 25 at the courthouse with Sarah and her family and Tom's parents. Small and simple, and nothing like what I'd imagined when I was 17, and still thought my parents would be there for things like that. I had a whole life by then, a husband and a career and an apartment and friends. I went days without thinking about my parents, sometimes weeks. And then in November, when I was 26, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a woman said she was calling from Allied Collections Agency about an outstanding debt. I was loading the dishwasher, and I tucked the phone under my chin, and I said there must be a mistake because I didn't have any credit cards. She said the account was opened in 2011 in my name, and the balance was $18,000 with fees and interest, and it had been sent to collections after 6 months of non-payment. I stopped loading the dishwasher. I said when in 2011, and she said April 15th. 2 weeks before my parents left. My hand started shaking, and I put down the plate I was holding because I thought I might drop it. I asked her if she was sure about the date, and she said yes, and the account had been charged off as bad debt, but I was still legally liable. I asked her what the charges were for, and she said she couldn't give me that information over the phone, but I could request statements from the original creditor. I asked if there was a cosigner, and she said no, which meant I was fully responsible for the entire balance. She kept talking about payment plans and settlement offers, but I wasn't listening anymore because I was doing math in my head. April 15th. The guidance counselor called me on April 20th. My parents left May 1st. They opened a credit card in my name while I was still in high school, and they maxed it out, and then they left before I could find out. I told the woman I needed to call her back, and I hung up. I sat down on the kitchen floor and I tried to breathe. Tom wasn't home yet, and the apartment was quiet, and I just sat there staring at the dishwasher with the door still open. They didn't just abandon me. They sabotaged me on the way out. I called the credit card company the next day, and I asked for records of every charge on the account. They said they'd mail them within 10 business days. I counted down every single day waiting for that envelope. When it came, I opened it, standing in the hallway of my apartment building because I couldn't wait to get inside. There were 12 pages of statements starting in April 2011 and ending in October 2011. Groceries, gas stations, Home Depot, Target, normal everyday purchases spread across 6 months. 6 months of my parents using my name and my credit to pay for their regular life. The last charge was in October at a furniture store 3 towns over for $1,800. After that, nothing. They'd maxed it out and then just stopped. I spread the statements out on my kitchen table and I went through them line by line. I recognized some of the stores. The Kroger near our house, the Shell station my dad always used, the Home Depot where we bought supplies when we repainted my bedroom the summer before junior year. They'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. The credit card was just one piece of it. Tom came home and found me sitting there with papers everywhere, and I showed him, and he said, "We need to call the police." I said, "I don't even know where they are," and he said it doesn't matter, because this is identity theft, and it's a crime. We filed a police report that week. I brought the statements and the collections letter and a copy of the note they'd left. The officer taking the report asked if I wanted to press charges, and I said I just wanted it off my credit report. He said I'd need to file disputes with the credit bureaus and send them copies of the police report. He said it could take months to resolve. It took 8 months. 8 months of calling credit bureaus and sending certified letters and explaining over and over that I was 17 when the account was opened and I never signed anything. 8 months of watching my credit score drop every time I checked it because the debt was sitting there like a weight. The detective assigned to my case called me once in January. He said he'd tried to locate my parents, but their last known address was the house I grew up in, and they hadn't left a forwarding address. He said the statute of limitations for identity theft in our state was 12 years, so technically I could still press charges if I found them. He said most people don't pursue charges against family members. I asked him what happens if I do press charges, and he said it would be a felony, and they could face prison time, but it would be hard to prove intent without a confession. He said the case would probably go nowhere, and I'd just be dragging it out. I told him I'd think about it. The debt finally came off my credit report in June. I got a letter from the credit bureau saying the account had been removed due to confirmed fraud. I showed Tom and he said good, and then he said good, and then he asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, but I wasn't. Because now I understood what really happened. My parents didn't leave because they thought I was ready to be an adult. They didn't leave because of some parenting philosophy or tough love idea. They left because they'd stolen from me and they knew I'd find out eventually, and they didn't want to be there when I did. I didn't press charges. I told Tom we should just move on, and he didn't argue, but I could tell he thought I was making a mistake. I got pregnant 2 years later when I was 28. We hadn't been trying, but we weren't preventing it either, and when the test came back positive, Tom picked me up and spun me around in the bathroom. I thought about my parents for the first time in months. I wondered if they knew I was married or where I was living or what I was doing with my life. I wondered if they ever thought about me at all. Sarah's mom threw me a baby shower in July. She invited her friends and my coworkers and some of the neighbors from the street where I grew up, women I'd known my whole childhood who'd watched me graduate high school and helped Sarah's family take me in. One of them asked if my parents knew about the baby, and the room got quiet. Sarah's mom changed the subject fast, but I saw the looks people were giving each other. I posted one photo from the shower on Facebook. Just me and Sarah and the cake Sarah's mom made. I kept my profile private, and I only had 73 friends, and most of them were people from college or work who didn't know anything about my parents. 2 days later, I got a friend request from someone named Debbie Marshfield. The profile picture was a generic sunset photo, and there was almost no information on the page. No posts, no photos, just the sunset and a profile that said she lived in a town 40 minutes away. I didn't recognize the name, but it sounded vaguely familiar in the way small town names do. I thought maybe she was someone's mom from high school or a friend of Sarah's family. The town she listed was close enough that it made sense. I accepted the request because that's what you do in a small town when someone requests you. You assume you know them from somewhere even if you can't place them. 3 hours later, she sent me a message. It said, "You look happy in your photos, and do you ever think about your parents?" I stared at that message for a full minute before my brain caught up. I clicked on her profile again, and I looked harder this time. The sunset photo was professional quality, like a stock image. The friends list was hidden. The only visible information was the name and the town and the join date, which was 2 months ago. I went back to my own profile, and I scrolled through my photos. There weren't many. The baby shower picture, a few from my wedding, one of me and Tom at a restaurant for our anniversary, one from my college graduation with Sarah's family, one from my college graduation with Sarah's family. I looked at the graduation photo, and I could see Sarah's parents behind me with their arms around each other, and Sarah's little brother making a face at the camera. I could see the pride on their faces when they looked at me. Someone had been looking at these photos. Someone had been studying my life. I went back to the message, and I read it again. Do you ever think about your parents? Not do you miss them or have you heard from them? Do you ever think about them? Like they were checking to see if I remembered they existed. I didn't respond. I closed Facebook, and I sat there holding my phone and feeling sick. Tom asked what was wrong, and I showed him the message. He said it could be anyone, and maybe I was reading too much into it. He said block her and forget about it. I didn't block her right away. I kept going back to the profile trying to figure out who Debbie Marshfield was. I searched the name on Google and found 3 different women in our state, but none of them were in the right town. I searched the town name with my parents' names and got nothing. Then I looked at the sunset photo again. It looked too perfect, too professional. I right-clicked and selected Search Image on Google. The image came up on a stock photo website. Free download. 0 attribution required. My hands went cold. I clicked back to Debbie's friends list, but it was hidden. I looked at the About section, and there was nothing. No work history, no education, no interests. Just the fake name and the fake town and the fake photo. I went to my own Facebook, and I changed all my privacy settings to friends only. Then I went through my friends list, and I looked at every single privacy settings to friends only. Then I went through my friends list, and I think the section. Most of them were real people I knew. Coworkers with hundreds of photos, college friends with full profiles and tagged posts going back years, Sarah's family members with their whole lives documented online. And then there was Debbie Marshfield with her sunset photo and her blank profile in her town that was exactly 40 minutes from where I grew up. I called Sarah, and I asked if she knew anyone named Debbie Marshfield. She said no, and asked why. I told her about the message, and she went quiet for a second. She said, "You think it's them?" I said, "I don't know, but someone is watching me, and they know about my parents, and they're using a fake profile to do it." Sarah said her mom had Facebook, and maybe we could check her friends list to see if anyone connected to my parents had added her recently. I said okay, and she called her mom right then on three-way. Sarah's mom pulled up her Facebook and started reading through her recent friend requests. She had 14 pending, and most of them were people from church or parents of kids Sarah went to school with. Then she stopped and said, "There's a Debbie Marshfield here. Requested me 3 weeks ago. I haven't accepted it yet because I didn't recognize the name." My stomach dropped. 3 weeks ago was right before my baby shower, right before I posted the photo. Sarah's mom said the profile looks weird and there's nothing on it. She said, should I accept it to see what happens? And I said, no, don't accept it, just leave it. I asked if she could see any mutual friends, and she said no, and the profile is completely locked down. She said, I'm blocking this person right now. I went back to my own Facebook and I looked at when Debbie Marshfield had joined. June 18th. 2 months ago. I pulled up my photo history and I checked when I'd made my last public post. April. A photo of me and Tom hiking. My profile had been public until May, and then I'd changed it to friends only because Tom said I should be more careful. But for 3 years before that, it had been public. Anyone could have been looking. I clicked on Debbie Marshfield's profile one more time and I stared at that message. You look happy in your photos. They've been watching me. For how long I didn't know, but long enough to find Sarah's mom, and long enough to know I was pregnant, and long enough to decide now was the time to reach out, 40 minutes away, They'd been 40 minutes away this whole time. I blocked Debbie Marshfield and I reported the profile to Facebook for being fake. Then I went through every single one of my photos and I made sure they were all set to friends only. Tom came home and I told him what Sarah's mom found, and he said, "We need to document this." He took screenshots of the message before I blocked her, and he saved them in a folder on his computer labeled evidence. I asked evidence for what, and he said, in case we need it later. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about my parents sitting in a house 40 minutes away looking at photos of my wedding and my graduation and my baby shower. I kept thinking about them typing that message. "You look happy." Like they were glad. Like they'd been checking in to make sure their experiment worked. I got up at 2 in the morning, and I sat in the nursery we were setting up. We painted it yellow, and Tom had put together the crib, and there were boxes of baby clothes stacked in the corner. I looked at that room, and I thought about my daughter growing up never knowing her grandparents, and I didn't feel sad about it at all. I felt relieved, because if they'd been 40 minutes away for 10 years, and they'd never once tried to contact me except through a fake Facebook profile, then they weren't grandparents. They were strangers who happened to share my DNA. And strangers don't get access to my child. I went back to bed and Tom rolled over and put his arm around me. He said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I am." But I wasn't. Because now I knew they were out there and they were watching, and I had no idea what they wanted. My daughter was born in September on a Tuesday morning after 16 hours of labor. Tom was with me the whole time, and Sarah came as soon as visiting hours started. She brought flowers and a stuffed elephant, and she cried when she held the baby for the first time. The hospital had open visiting hours from noon to 8. Family and friends could come and go as long as they checked in at the nurse's station first. On the second day, a woman came into my room around 3 in the afternoon. She was in her 50s with gray hair, and she was carrying a gift bag with tissue paper sticking out the top. She said, "Hi, I'm Karen from St. Matthew's, and I heard you had your baby, and I wanted to stop by with a little something." I was half asleep and foggy from the epidural still wearing off. I said thank you, and she put the gift bag on the chair by the window and she walked over to the bassinet where my daughter was sleeping. She stood there looking down at her for a long time, and something felt wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. She said she's beautiful, and what's her name? I told her, and she repeated it back slowly like she was memorizing it. Then she reached down toward the bassinet, and I said, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" She pulled her hand back, and she said, "I just wanted to see her up close." I said, "I don't know you," and she said, "I'm from the church, and I volunteer in the maternity ward sometimes." I looked at her more carefully. She wasn't wearing a volunteer badge. She wasn't wearing scrubs. She was just in regular clothes with a cardigan and jeans. I said, "What church?" and she said, "St. Matthew's." And I said, "I don't go to St. Matthew's." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, and she said, "Well, I heard about the baby through a friend, and I wanted to stop by." I said, "What friend?" She didn't answer. She just looked at my daughter again, and then she looked at me, and I saw something in her face that made my whole body go cold. I knew who she was. I hit the call button for the nurse, and I said, "You need to leave right now." She said, "I just wanted to meet her," and I said, "Get out." The nurse came in and asked if everything was okay, and I said, "This woman needs to leave. She's not a friend, and she's not from any church." The nurse looked at the woman and said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." My mother didn't argue. She just picked up the gift bag from the chair, and she walked out of the room with the nurse following her. I was shaking so hard I couldn't hold my phone. Tom had gone home to shower and change, and I called him and I said, "You need to come back right now. My mother was just here." He said, "What do you mean she was there?" And I said she pretended to be a volunteer, and she got into my room and she tried to touch the baby. He said, "I'm on my way," and he hung up. The nurse came back 10 minutes later, and she said security escorted her out of the building. She said the woman claimed she was family, but when we asked for ID, she said she left it in her car, and then she just left. I asked if she said anything else, and the nurse said she seemed upset that we were making her leave. She said something about every little girl needs her grandmother. I felt like I was going to throw up. I asked if the hospital could put a note on my file that she's not allowed back, and the nurse said yes, absolutely. She said, "We'll flag your room and security will be notified." Tom got there 20 minutes later, and he looked at our daughter sleeping in the bassinet, and then he looked at me and he said, "We're getting a restraining order." I said, "I don't even know where she lives," and he said, "We know she's close enough to show up here, and that's enough." The gift bag was still sitting on the chair. The nurse had forgotten to take it when she escorted my mother out. I made Tom open it because I couldn't touch it. Inside was a baby blanket with pink elephants on it and a card. The card had a generic message printed inside about new babies and joy. Under the printed message in handwriting I recognized was a note. It said she needs her grandmother, and every little girl does, and we can help you if you let us. I stared at that handwriting. The same handwriting from the note 10 years ago. "You're an adult now." Tom took the card and the blanket and he put them in a plastic bag. He said, "We're keeping this and we're taking it to a lawyer." I didn't sleep that night. Every time a nurse came in to check on me or the baby, I startled awake. I kept thinking about my mother standing over the bassinet reaching down toward my daughter. We left the hospital the next day and Tom drove 10 miles under the speed limit the whole way home. We got our daughter inside and settled, and then Tom said, "We need to talk about this." I said, "I know," and he said, "Your mother knows where we live now?" She probably followed us from the hospital, or she already knew from Facebook. I said we made everything private, and he said it doesn't matter because she's been watching for years and she knows enough. He asked if I was ready to file a restraining order, and I said yes. We met with a lawyer the following week. Her name was Patricia, and she specialized in family law. I brought the note from when my parents left and the screenshots from the Debbie Marshfield Facebook account and the card from the hospital. Patricia read everything, and then she asked how long it had been since I'd had contact with my parents. I said 10 years, and she said that's good for the restraining order because it shows a clear pattern of abandonment followed by unwanted contact. She asked if my mother had threatened me, and I said no. Not exactly, but she tried to touch my baby without permission, and she said the baby needs her. Patricia said that's not legally a threat, but combined with the abandonment and the fake Facebook profile, it shows concerning behavior. She said we could file for a protection order based on harassment and fear of harm. I asked what happens if they violate it, and she said it's a criminal charge and they could be arrested. Tom said good, and when can we file? We filed the paperwork that afternoon. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. The night before the hearing, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was my father. His voice sounded exactly the same, and hearing it made me feel like I was 17 again, standing in an empty kitchen holding a note. He said, "Sweetheart, we need to talk." And I said, "Don't call me that." He said, "Your mother told me what happened at the hospital, and you have to understand we were just trying to meet our granddaughter." I said, "You don't have a granddaughter, and you don't have a daughter." He talked over me. He said, "We know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but we did what we thought was best at the time." I said, "You stole my identity, and you destroyed my credit, and you abandoned me the night before a scholarship deadline?" He said, "We didn't steal anything, and that credit card was meant to help you build credit, and we thought you'd figure it out." I couldn't breathe right. I said, "You thought I'd figure out that you opened a credit card in my name and maxed it out and left me with $18,000 in debt." He said it wasn't like that, and we were going to pay it off, but things got complicated. I said, "Complicated how?" And he didn't answer. Then he said, "We've been keeping an eye on you all these years, and we're so proud of how you turned out. He said we knew you'd be fine, and you proved us right." I said, "Keeping an eye on me?" And he said, "We just wanted to make sure you were okay." I said, "You've been stalking me for 10 years. He said, "That's not fair, and we're your parents, and we have a right to know how you're doing." I was crying, and I hated that I was crying because I didn't want him to hear it. I said, "You gave up your rights when you left, and you don't get to come back now because I have something you want." He went quiet for a second, and then he said, "We never wanted to hurt you, and this was always about teaching you to stand on your own." He said, "We needed you to struggle enough to appreciate us, and we were going to come back once you realized you needed your parents." I felt something break open in my chest. I said, "You wanted me to fail?" And he said, "No. We wanted you to grow," and I said, "By sabotaging my scholarship and stealing my identity." He said, "We thought you'd come looking for us, and when you didn't, we realized you were stronger than we expected." He said, "We're sorry we waited so long, but we're ready now, and we want to be in our granddaughter's life." I said, "You're never going to meet her," and he said, "You can't keep her from us, and we have rights as grandparents." Then he hung up. I sat there holding my phone, and Tom came in and asked who it was. I told him, and he said, "Did he threaten you?" And I said, "No, but he said they have grandparent rights." Tom looked it up on his phone, and he said, "In our state, grandparents can petition for visitation if they can prove it's in the child's best interest." He said, "But they'd have to show they had an existing relationship with the child, or that denying access would cause harm." I said, "They've never met her?" And he said, "Exactly so. They don't have a case." But I couldn't stop thinking about what my father said. We have rights as grandparents. The restraining order hearing was the next morning. My parents didn't show up, but their lawyer did. The lawyer argued that my parents had tried to reconnect, and I was being unreasonable, and they just wanted to meet their grandchild. He said the hospital visit was a misunderstanding and the Facebook account was just a way to check on me without causing conflict. Patricia presented the note from 10 years ago, and the credit card statements, and the fake profile evidence and the hospital incident report. She said my parents had abandoned me as a minor and committed identity theft, and then stalked me for a decade. The judge read through everything, and then he asked the other lawyer if there was any explanation for the credit card. The lawyer said my parents claimed it was meant to help me, and they'd been planning to pay it off. The judge asked why they never did, and the lawyer said circumstances prevented it. The judge looked at my parents' lawyer for a long time, and then he said, "The restraining order is granted for 1 year. He said if they make any contact with me or my family during that time, it will be extended and criminal charges may be filed." I thought that was the end of it. 2 days later, Patricia called and she said my parents filed a petition for grandparent visitation rights. She said the hearing is scheduled for next month and we need to prepare a response. I said, how can they file for visitation when they just got a restraining order against them? And she said the restraining order is separate from grandparent rights, and technically they can still petition the court even if they can't contact us directly. She said it's unlikely they'll win, but we need to take it seriously. Tom said, this is insane. And Patricia said, I know, but this is how the system works. I looked at my daughter sleeping in her car seat, and I thought about my parents sitting in a courtroom asking a judge for permission to see her. And I realized they were never going to stop. Patricia said we had a strong case, but we needed to be strategic about how we presented it. She said the court would look at whether my parents had an existing relationship with my daughter and whether denying them access would harm her. She said obviously they don't have a relationship because they've never met her, but we need to explain why that's their fault and not mine. I said, isn't the abandonment enough? And she said it helps, but it was 10 years ago and the judge will want to know why I'm refusing contact now. She said, we need to show a pattern of behavior that makes them unsafe or unfit. Tom said, what about the identity theft? And Patricia said, that's good, but we need to prove it. She asked if I'd ever filed a police report, and I said yes, 8 years ago when I was trying to clear the debt. She said we need to get a copy of that report and any documentation from the credit card company. She said if we can show they committed a crime against me, it strengthens our case that they shouldn't have access to my child. I went home and I pulled out the folder I'd kept from the identity theft dispute. I had the police report and the credit card statements and the letters from the credit bureaus confirming the fraud. I'd kept everything because Tom said we might need it someday. I brought it all to Patricia and she went through it page by page. She stopped on the police report and she said this was filed in 2019 and the credit card was opened in 2011. She said that's 8 years. I said I didn't find out about it until the collections agency called, and she said, when was that? I said November 2018, and she did the math. 6 months between discovery and filing the report. She asked why I waited, and I said I was scared and I didn't think anything would come of it. She said that's understandable, but the other side will use that gap to argue you weren't really concerned about the theft. Tom said that's not fair, and Patricia said I know, but we need to be prepared for it. Then she looked at the date on the credit card statements again and she said, wait, she said, the card was opened in April 2011 and you turned 18 in June 2011. She said you were still a minor when they opened it. I said yes, and she said that changes things. She pulled up something on her computer and she said the statute of limitations for identity theft in our state is 12 years, but there's an exception for minors. She said, when the victim is a minor, the clock doesn't start until they turn 18 or until they discover the fraud, whichever comes later. She said you didn't discover the fraud until 2018, so the statute didn't start running until then. I said so, they can still be charged, and she said yes if you want to pursue it. She said it would be a felony, and it would definitely impact the custody case. Tom said we should do it, and I said, I don't know. Patricia said, I understand this is family, but you need to think about what's best for your daughter. She said, if your parents are willing to commit identity theft against their own child, what else are they capable of? I sat there looking at those credit card statements, and I thought about my mother reaching toward my daughter's bassinet. I thought about my father saying they had rights. I said, what do I have to do? And Patricia said we file a new police report with all this documentation. She said, I'll write a letter explaining the statute of limitations issue and the detective will investigate. She said it could take months and there's no guarantee they'll be charged, but if they are, it will be very hard for them to win a custody petition while facing criminal charges. I asked, what if they come after me for filing charges? And she said that's what the restraining order is for. She said any contact they make will violate it and they'll be arrested. Tom said, "When can we file?" And Patricia said, "I can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow." I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about my parents getting arrested and going to court and having a criminal record. I kept thinking about how this would ruin their lives the way they'd tried to ruin mine. But then I thought about my daughter, and I thought about what kind of example I'd be setting if I let them get away with it just because they were family. We filed the police report the next morning. I brought every piece of documentation I had, and I sat across from a detective named Morrison, and I told him the whole story. He listened, and he took notes, and when I finished, he said, "This is pretty clear-cut identity theft." He said, "The only question is whether we can still prosecute given the timeline." I gave him Patricia's letter explaining the statute of limitations, and he read it, and he said, "Okay, this makes sense." He said, "Because you were a minor when the crime occurred and you didn't discover it until 2018, we're still within the window." He asked if I knew where my parents lived, and I said no, but I know they're within 40 minutes because my mother showed up at the hospital. He said, "We'll start with the address from the credit card statements and go from there." He said it might take a few weeks to investigate, but he'd be in touch. 3 weeks later, Morrison called and he said, "We found them." He said they're living in a town 38 minutes from here, and they've been at the same address for 9 years. I felt sick hearing that. 9 years. They'd been that close the entire time. Morrison said he'd spoken to them and they'd admitted to opening the credit card, but they claimed it was meant to help me build credit. He said they also admitted they'd never made any payments on it. He said based on the evidence and their admission, he was recommending charges. He said the DA would make the final decision, but it looked like they'd be charged with felony identity theft. I asked when, and he said probably within the next 2 weeks. He said they'd be notified by mail and they'd have to turn themselves in for booking. Tom asked if they'd go to jail, and Morrison said probably not unless they have a record. He said most likely they'd be released on their own recognizance, and then there'd be a court date. The custody hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Morrison said he'd try to have the charges filed before then so we could present them to the judge. Patricia said that would be ideal because it shows an ongoing pattern of criminal behavior and not just something from the past. I asked what happens if they don't get charged in time, and she said, "We still have a strong case, but the criminal charges make it stronger." 2 weeks later, Morrison called again, and he said the DA approved the charges. He said my parents were being charged with 1 count of felony identity theft, and they'd been notified by certified mail. He said they had 7 days to turn themselves in. I marked it on the calendar. 7 days. On the 6th day, Patricia called and she said my parents' lawyer contacted her. She said they want to drop the custody petition in exchange for you not pursuing the criminal charges. I said, "Can we do that?" And she said technically the charges are up to the DA now, but you could ask the DA not to prosecute. She said it's called victim impact and your opinion matters. Tom said absolutely not, and I said I agree. Patricia said, "I thought you'd say that, but I had to ask." She said the custody hearing is in 3 weeks and the criminal charges are filed, so they'll have to address both at the same time. I asked if they'd show up to the hearing, and she said they have to if they want any chance at visitation. She said their lawyer will probably argue that the charges are retaliatory and that you're using the legal system to punish them. I said, "That's not what this is," and she said, "I know, but be prepared to hear it." The day before the custody hearing, my parents turned themselves in. Morrison called and told me they'd been booked and released within 4 hours. He said they were scheduled for arraignment the following month. The custody hearing was at 9 in the morning. Tom and I got there early, and Patricia met us in the hallway. She said my parents were already inside with their lawyer. I hadn't seen them in 10 years, and I didn't know if I was ready. We walked into the courtroom, and they were sitting at a table on the left side. My mother looked older, and her hair was completely gray. My father had gained weight, and he was wearing a suit I didn't recognize. They both looked at me when I walked in. My mother's eyes went to my daughter in Tom's arms, and she started to stand up, but her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder, and she sat back down. The judge came in, and we all stood. His name was Judge Brennan, and Patricia said he was fair but strict about procedure. My parents' lawyer went first. He said his clients were loving parents who'd made a difficult decision years ago to help their daughter become independent. He said they'd kept their distance to allow her to grow, but they'd always cared about her well-being. He said they'd recently learned they had a grandchild, and they simply wanted the opportunity to be part of her life. He said every child deserves to know their grandparents, and my parents had done nothing to warrant being completely cut off. Then he said the identity theft charges were retaliatory and filed only after his clients petitioned for visitation. He said I was using the legal system to punish them for trying to reconnect. Judge Brennan asked when the charges were filed, and Morrison was there as a witness, and he said, 3 weeks ago. The judge asked when the custody petition was filed, and the lawyer said 5 weeks ago. The judge said, so the charges came after the petition, and the lawyer said yes, exactly. Patricia stood up and she said, Your Honor, the charges are related to a crime that occurred in 2011 when my client was a minor. She said my client only discovered the fraud in 2018 and filed an initial report at that time, but was told by the detective that prosecution was unlikely. She said new information about the statute of limitations for minors came to light during preparation for this custody case, and that's when my client decided to pursue charges. The judge asked what new information, and Patricia explained the delayed discovery rule for minors. She said the DA reviewed the evidence and determined the charges were valid regardless of the custody petition. Then Patricia presented the credit card statements, and the police reports, and the hospital incident report, and the Facebook evidence. She laid it all out in chronological order. She said my parents hadn't just made a difficult parenting decision. She said they'd abandoned their minor child the night before a scholarship deadline, and they'd committed identity theft before they left, and they'd stalked her for years using a fake social media account. She said when my mother finally made physical contact, it was by lying to hospital staff and attempting to access my newborn daughter without permission. Judge Brennan read through everything. He looked at the note from 2011, and he looked at the credit card statements, and he looked at the screenshots from the Debbie Marshfield account. Then he looked at my parents and he said, I'd like to hear from you directly. He said, why did you leave your daughter the way you did? My father stood up and he said, we thought we were doing the right thing. He said we wanted her to learn to stand on her own, and we thought she was ready. The judge said you left her the night before a scholarship deadline that required a parental signature. My father said we didn't know about the timing. Judge Brennan picked up the note and he read it out loud. You're an adult now. You don't need us anymore. He said this note was left on a table next to scholarship paperwork. He said, you expect me to believe you didn't know about the timing? My father didn't answer. The judge asked about the credit card, and my father said it was meant to help her build credit. The judge said by maxing it out and never making a payment. My father said circumstances prevented us from paying it back. Judge Brennan said, what circumstances? And my father said we were going through financial difficulties. The judge said, if you were going through financial difficulties, why were you charging groceries and furniture to a credit card in your daughter's name? My father said we made a mistake. Then the judge asked about the Facebook account, and my mother said we just wanted to see how she was doing. The judge said you could have called or written a letter. My mother said we didn't think she'd want to hear from us. The judge said, but you thought she'd want you to show up at the hospital pretending to be a volunteer. My mother started crying and she said, we just wanted to meet our granddaughter. The judge said, by lying to medical staff and violating your daughter's clearly stated boundaries. He looked at the restraining order file and he said, you've been ordered to stay away from this family, and yet you filed a petition for visitation rights before the ink was dry. My parents' lawyer said they have a legal right to petition, and Judge Brennan said yes, they do, and I have a legal obligation to determine what's in the child's best interest. He said I see no evidence that denying these petitioners access to the child would cause harm. He said, in fact, I see significant evidence that granting access could cause harm given the pattern of deception and criminal behavior. He said the petition for grandparent visitation is denied. Then he looked at my parents and he said, you're facing felony charges, and if you're convicted, you'll have even less standing to petition for custody or visitation. He said, I strongly suggest you focus on resolving your criminal case. He said, this hearing is concluded, and he stood up and walked out. My parents sat there, and my mother was still crying. My father put his arm around her, and he looked at me, and I looked back at him, and I didn't feel anything. Patricia said, let's go, and we walked out of the courtroom. Outside in the hallway, she said, that went as well as it could have. She said the judge saw right through them and they have no case. I asked what happens next, and she said they could appeal, but it's unlikely to succeed. She said the criminal case will proceed separately, and depending on the outcome, the restraining order could be extended. Tom said, how long can we extend it? And Patricia said, up to 5 years at a time with the option to renew. I looked at my daughter, and she was sleeping in Tom's arms, completely unaware of everything that had just happened. I thought about how she'd never have to know any of this unless I told her. Patricia said, you did the right thing, and I said, I know. But my hands were shaking, and Tom had to drive us home because I couldn't hold the wheel steady. The criminal charges took 4 more months to resolve. My parents were arraigned in December, and they pled not guilty. Lisa from the DA's office said they were hoping for a dismissal based on the statute of limitations, but the judge ruled the clock started when I discovered the debt, not when the card was opened. She said that gave us another 6 months of legal window and the charges would stand. In February, my parents' lawyer contacted Patricia about a plea deal. They'd plead guilty to reduced charges if the felony was dropped to a misdemeanor and they could avoid jail time. Lisa called me and asked what I thought. She said we could push for trial and probably win, but it would take another year and I'd have to testify in detail about everything. I asked what the plea deal would mean, and she said they'd have a criminal record and they'd be on probation for 3 years and they'd have to pay restitution for the original debt plus interest. She said it's not prison, but it's a permanent record, and it would show up on background checks and they'd be convicted criminals. I said okay, and she said, "Are you sure? Because we can fight for more?" I said I just want it to be over. They accepted the plea deal in March. I didn't go to the hearing, but Patricia did, and she called me after. She said my parents both pled guilty, and the judge accepted the deal, and they were sentenced to 3 years probation and ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution. She said your father tried to make a statement, and the judge cut him off. She said he wanted to apologize and explain, and the judge said the time for explanations was 10 years ago. Patricia said the restraining order is still active for 4 more years, and after that it's up to you whether you want to renew it. I said I will. Tom and I moved 6 months later to a town 2 hours away. We didn't tell anyone except Sarah and her family where we were going. We bought a house with a fenced yard and we changed our phone numbers, and I locked down every social media account I had. My daughter turned 1 in September, and we had a party in our backyard with Sarah's family and Tom's parents and some neighbors from our new street. She smashed a cake with her hands, and Sarah took about 100 photos. I didn't post any of them online. Sarah's mom asked me once if I ever thought about reaching out to my parents, and I said no. She said even after everything, and I said especially after everything. She hugged me and said I understand. Tom's parents asked a few times if my parents knew about their granddaughter, and I told them the truth. I said they tried to force their way into her life, and a judge said no. And that was the end of it. Tom's mom said, "Family is complicated," and I said no, it's actually really simple. She said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Family shows up." She didn't ask again after that. My daughter is 3 now. She's never met my parents, and she never will. When she asks about grandparents, I tell her about Sarah's parents and Tom's parents, and I say those are the people who chose to be in our lives. She doesn't know what she's missing because there's nothing to miss. I heard through someone who still lives in my hometown that my parents sold their house and moved. I don't know where they went, and I don't want to know. The restraining order expires next year, and I've already started the paperwork to renew it. Sometimes I think about the scholarship and the life I would have had if they'd just signed the paper. But then I think about the life I built instead and the people who showed up when I needed them, and I realize I didn't lose anything when my parents left. I just finally saw them clearly. Sarah's parents are Grandma Jean and Grandpa Bill to my daughter. Tom's parents are Nana and Pop. Those are the people who come to birthday parties and babysit on date nights and teach her how to ride a bike. Those are the people who earned the title. My parents didn't abandon me to teach me a lesson or help me grow. They abandoned me because they were broken in some way I'll never understand, and they couldn't face what they'd done. And that's not my burden to carry anymore. I still have the note they left. I keep it in a box in my closet with the hospital card and the credit card statements and all the documentation from the court cases. I don't look at it very often, but I keep it because it reminds me of something important. It reminds me that when someone makes you prove your worthiness of love, they're not offering love at all. They're offering a test you can never pass, and the only way to win is to stop taking it. My daughter will grow up knowing she's loved without conditions. She'll know that family isn't about blood or obligation or second chances for people who never deserved a first one. She'll know that family is the people who show up. And if that's the only thing I teach her, then I've done my job. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. These stories matter because they remind us we're not alone in the complicated, painful, messy parts of life. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to Daily Karma Reads because we post new stories every single day. Stories about betrayal and consequences and the people who finally got free. I'll see you in the next one.